Talk 49.
David Lane, the well-known radio personality, is talking to us today. David Lane, welcome to Talk 49.
It's great to be joining you, Nigel, all the way over there on Talk 49 in Vienna.
Yeah. And where exactly are you in England, David?
Well, I'm in a tiny little village called Eastoft, which is in a very rural county in the east of England called Lincolnshire. Famous, Lincoln itself, the county town, is famous for its Gothic cathedral.
Gothic cathedral. David, you're a man of radio. What was the spark that got you interested in radio in the first place?
Well, before I actually became involved in radio, the spark, I suppose, was my love of music, or is my love of music. And particularly 1960s music. I became a teenager at the start of the 60s decade. So by the end of the decade, I was well into my 20s. And I grew up in the 1960s. There are lots of people that say that if you can remember the 1960s, you didn't live through it. Well, I lived through it, and I can remember a lot of things. So yes, it was a love of music, and back then I never even thought that I'd be involved in radio. It was 20 years later before I had the opportunity to get involved, so to speak. And that's quite a story in itself.
Tell us this story, David. How did you get involved?
Well, back in 1982, I was running a youth work project for, very indirectly, the United Nations. The United Nations had designated that particular year, 83-84, as International Youth Year. And I was running a project in Shropshire, in the Midlands, in the centre of England. And a local BBC radio station, Radio Shropshire, had just opened, and they interviewed me about the work I was doing. I don't know how it happened, but from that I started making regular contributions, and then being involved in a little bit of presentational work, then a bit more on a voluntary basis, this was. Then they trained me on how to use a radio car without electrocuting anyone, because there have been cases of people going out with radio cars and radio vans, raising the mast, forgetting to pull it down, and then driving off into power lines and causing all sorts of problems. And from that, there I was involved on a weekly show, and a friend of mine said, there's a new independent radio station opening in Stoke-on-Trent, and they're looking for presenters. Send them a demo tape. This was when we used tape. So I did, went for an interview, and they offered me a freelance position, presenting initially an early Sunday morning breakfast show, which went on to cover other stand-in shows. And in those early days in independent radio, it was very exciting. It was pioneering. Everyone wore different hats. So I was a presenter. I was also business news editor. So I was working with the journalists. I was motoring correspondent, forerunner for Top Gear. And that was good because I got a different car to try out every week. And it ranged everything from I once had a Bentley for a week, all the way down to a Mini. And I got involved there, and I worked at that radio station, Signal Radio in Stoke-on-Trent, until the end of the 1980s, becoming more and more involved. And that was it. I got the bug. You're involved in radio. Now, do you know, once radio gets into your bloodstream, that's it. You can't get rid of it.
What was the first time like when your first red light went on? Your first ever time before a mic live? Can you remember that?
I can. I can. Terrified.
You were terrified.
Absolutely. No, very, very nervous. Am I pushing am I opening the right fader? Am I doing this? Have I closed the microphone fader? One of the funny things was when I with the transition between the BBC and independent radio, back in those days, the BBC thought radio presenters were a little bit thick, and their mixing desks, the faders, to open them, you brought them down, not push them up. Because they said radio presenters lean on the desk and they'll open the fader, and all sorts of things that happen. So back in those days, all their mixing desks, the faders worked, well, opposite to the way what you and I are used to them. So when I moved to independent radio, it was the other way round, and that took a while to get used to as well. It was, they were exciting days back then.
What was the atmosphere like in the studios in those days?
I can only say, the one way I can describe it, you probably think this is a bit weird, but a bit Wild West, because it was pioneering days. In those days, there were independent local radio stations in every major town and city, and they were all individual. Sadly now, they've all been swallowed up by conglomerates. In fact, over here in the UK, there are now only 2 organisations that own every single local radio station, which is sad because basically it isn't local radio anymore. It's all coming from London, Manchester, or Birmingham. And the local studios are closing down. Lots of my friends, sadly, are now unemployed.
Okay,
That's a recent thing.
We'll come back to that in just a little while,
Yes,
David.
sure.
But after Signal Radio, which sounds tremendous fun, what happened next? What happened next?
Well, to keep it simple, because I don't want to take up all your programme, Nigel. I moved while working for Signal Radio. I mentioned that I was a business news editor, and I had a business programme looking at local businesses, and I was offered the job of managing director of a TV and video retail company who were expanding into the east of the country, hence the move from the West Midlands over to where we live now. And I was a bit reluctant, but my then wife, and we won't go into details about that, but my then wife really never liked me working in radio. She thought it was a little bit beneath her. She liked the idea of a company BMW and everything, so she persuaded me to accept this. So we moved to Lincoln, but I didn't get away from radio because I then got involved in a consortium that was looking to set up local radio in Lincolnshire. So I still, even though I was no longer actively working in radio, I was still doing things behind the scenes.
Well, what happened in local radio in Lincolnshire? Did you present?
We had a couple. Well, I'm trying to think how many times. There are things in this country called RSLs, restricted service licenses, that people or prospective radio stations can take out, and you're allowed to broadcast on a specific frequency for a specific time, maybe a month or 2 months. It's basically to get the public used to something new. We were called Castle Radio because our studio was based at Lincoln Castle. And obviously, it was the franchise was coming up, and there were other people involved. We had a major backer, Castle Radio, who at the last minute pulled out and decided to support another applicant, and we lost out to them. Having said that, Lynx FM were a brilliant organisation. Sadly, they're one of the radio stations and radio groups that have been taken over by one of these 2 big consortiums. So I was involved on a daily show there with Castle Radio for a while, and after that there was a gap, literally from about 1994 all the way up through to, I suppose it must be 2000, 20 years maybe, without any radio. And I saw that there was an internet radio station based close to where I live, setting up, looking for presenters. So I contacted them and said, look, I worked in radio 20 years ago and, I know a bit about it. Are you interested? It was called South Humberside Community Radio, SHC. And they said yes. And that was a bit of a shock because I walked into their studio, bearing in mind that I'd worked in radio in the 80s and early 90s when we had those little round black things with a hole in the middle called 45s, and we used turntables and played our music from records. I walked into the studio there wasn't a turntable in sight, and I was surrounded by computers. And it was a little bit daunting because I'd never worked in radio this way, but fortunately got into it reasonably quickly. SHCR was around for 2 or 3 years. Sadly, it's that closed. But during that time, I'd become involved in something that I think is maybe unique to the United Kingdom called hospital radio. Lots of hospitals in the UK have a radio station that broadcasts either purely internally to patients or they stream on net. In fact, 1 or 2 of them have an FM frequency as well. And I got involved at Scunthorpe Hospital Radio, I ended up doing a Sunday morning show. I do a couple of shows a week now. And around about the same time as well, I joined a community radio station, very similar to Radio Orange, I imagine, in Doncaster, in Yorkshire, called Sign FM, presenting a drive time show initially. So I'd started to get back into radio, and things have just moved on. Okay, now with the COVID-19 situation,
You're mentioning.
Sorry, were you?
Yeah, just a minute. Your hospital radio in Scunthorpe, hospital radio Scunthorpe. How does this work with the producer-listener point of view? Because you're obviously very closer to your audience in a hospital radio than on national radio or whatever.
Well, if you listen to if you were listening to hospital radio, you wouldn't the really good ones. You wouldn't know that it was such a local setup. We, under normal circumstances, communicate with patients by actually visiting the wards and chatting to them, sometimes interviewing them if they have something interesting. But they can ask for requests. During live shows as well, under normal circumstances, they can actually call a request line and ask for requests. So the programming is very similar to normal music, radio music stations, with request shows, with specific genres of music. I mean, there are 50s shows, 60s, 70s, rock shows, and I'm trying to think. There's a young lady by the name of Sarah who does a brass band show. So we cater for, bearing in mind that the age range of people in hospital can literally be from young children up to people, even older than me. So yes, the musical tastes vary so much. I mean, I've had some quite weird requests. If I can tell you a little story, I was on the ward, this was a couple of years ago, and chatting to this lady who must have been well into her 80s. She was in hospital for a relatively minor operation. I think she was having a new knee. Her son was sitting with her, and I asked this lady if she'd like a request, and she said, yes, please. And the son interrupted and said, oh, you'd like something from Michael Bublé, wouldn't you? And very indignantly, she said, no, I would not. I want AC/DC. So there I was playing heavy metal for this 80-plus-year-old lady. People's musical tastes, as you know, Nigel, vary so much.
That's quite right. So this is hospital radio. It plays a very, very important role for very, very many people. And then you've got the radio show in Doncaster. Is that still an ongoing thing? Doncaster?
No, there've been changes there, and I'm not involved in Doncaster now, but I am involved with three other internet-based radio stations, two of which are ex-pirate radio stations: Radio North Sea International and Swinging Radio England.
David, can I just stop you just for a sec? Because
Yep.
not many of us here know what pirate stations are or were. Could you just tell us just one little bit, very, very
Pirate
quickly?
Radio. Well, we need to go back to the 1960s, where my first love of music came into things. Several entrepreneurs, including a young man by the name of Ronan O'Reilly, set up what ended up being called pirate radio stations. Most of these were on offshore ships outside the 3-mile limit, with a massive transmitter mast and made it look very unstable. And they broadcast to the UK, but it wasn't illegal at the time because they were outside the international limit of 3 miles. But the government didn't like it for some reason, and they had a big down on pirate radio. The most famous one, of course, is Ronan's Radio Caroline. Radio Caroline, Swinging Radio London, Radio North Sea International, Radio 257, all sorts. And what happened was, in the end, Harold Wilson's government brought in an Act of Parliament, a law that made pirate radio illegal. It was called the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act, which came out on my birthday in 1967.
Okay, so basically pirate radio stations were on ships playing the music that everybody loved, but then became
Yep.
illegal. And so it must be a bit of nostalgia now with these stations going back on the internet.
Oh, very much so, very much so.
And this is what
And
you're...
it's not just in the UK, because I mean I've got listeners in America, Australia, Indonesia, because
Okay.
it's internet radio, and it obviously strikes a chord with people.
Can I move on to internet radio? Because you're saying now that all these local stations are being closed down in Britain, but is the future for radio internet radio?
That's a difficult one. I think yes, initially, more and more internet stations are springing up all over the country. I don't know what it's like in your part of the world, Nigel, but there are more and more stations, and they are specific stations. You find that they might concentrate on a particular genre of music or a particular type of music. There are multinational stations. There are Asian stations. There are reggae stations.
Yeah. Okay. But it means that the big, powerful...
Yes.
The established radio, BBC, and these other big companies are not having it all to themselves, it looks like.
Oh no. They are losing listeners. They are losing. I don't know if in your country now do you have organisations that actually monitor listener hours.
We do, yeah.
It's the same in the UK, and you can see national radio stations like Radio 1, Radio 2, and the large conglomerates. Their listening figures go down, and the so-called small independent internet stations, their listenership's going up. And of course, modern technology is aiding this because so many people now have smart speakers, and you can just ask your smart speaker to play XYZ radio, and they will.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Will there be a David Lane radio station one day?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It would be, if I was maybe 20, 30 years younger, I might consider it because this sounds a bit bombastic, and I don't mean it to be. I've got the equipment and the setup to be able to do it. I just need to set up a stream.
Okay.
But I know can cause a lot of headaches, and I'm quite happy just to play my music, talk to people occasionally, because on the music, you know this, on the music program, people don't want to listen to the presenter all the time. They want to hear the music that they love.
David, one last question. If you were to come back again, would you do it all over again?
Definitely, and if I had the opportunity, I'd possibly start 25 years earlier.
Wow. On a pirate ship?
On a pirate ship, or even a rowing boat.
Or even a rowing boat. David, a great way to end. David Lane, thank you for talking to Talk 49.
It's been a pleasure, Nigel. Thank you.
No, thanks.
Talk 49.